Can you tell me your name and occupation?
I'm Kieran Hannon, and I'm actually a school teacher, and but I have an interest in. I'm a science maths teacher, but I have an interest in history.
And what brings you to Cato Street today?
Well, my great grandfather was on the Guildford Four, which was a convict ship which the Cato Street conspirators was on, and I found out information about him. Then I started to investigate the other men that were on the ship, and the five Cato Street conspirators took my interest, sparked my interest.
Okay, great. And then can you give a broad overview of the lives of the Cato Street conspirators, the five that were transported to Australia?
Yes, well, the five that were transported, they left the prison at 11 o'clock on the 1st of May. They were taken directly to Portsmouth. They were put onto the Leviathan Hulk. Then they were transferred onto the Guildford Four, the ship called the Guildford Four. Transport ships to Australia were named the name of the ship, and then after that was the trip that was on, and this was the fourth trip of the Guildford, so it's called the Guildford Four. That they stayed in the Solent for until the 14th of May, and then they moved off. They moved away from England on the 14th of May, and they arrived in. They had a stopover in Simonstown and Cape Town, and then they arrived in Sydney. The conspirators were placed into the cell with the boy conspirators. The boy convicts, the youngest convicts. They were separated from the male convicts. They were then taken off the ship on the 6th of October 1820, put into Sydney jail, and then moved to the secondary penal settlement in Newcastle, north of Sydney. It was for dangerous convicts.
Okay. So you researched and wrote about the five transported conspirators.
Correct. Yeah.
Why do you think their experiences have been ignored until your work?
That's a good question. Well, I think that people are here in England, and so they have easy access to the archives. You know, I've been in the archives in Kew many a time, but the information is all in Australia. So the information is there, and nobody has really moved across. But so I think I have access to that information, and it's easily accessible for me, or reasonably easily accessible as compared to people here. So.
Okay. Then I wanted to ask you too about how was the conspirators who were transported, how was their experience different than an average convict?
Yes. Well, they were different. They were definitely different. They were singled out. Everybody knew about them. They had a reputation. There was a reputation that went with all the people like the Fenians, etc., that came along. They had sort of a semi, I don't know what you say, sort of celebrity status. So a lot of the more aggressive type convicts would look up to them, and also some of the people in charge were interested in them because of the part they played. So one thing about the Cato Street conspirators was they could not. A lot of the convicts sort of faded away, and they tried to, once their sentence was over, then they tried to distance themselves, but the Cato Street conspirators couldn't do that.
Who of the conspirators do you think was the most successful settling into their lives in Australia?
John Shaw Strange was definitely the most successful. He was the most successful financially, and for example, of the five conspirators there, he was the only one who had a obituary in the papers. You know, they took their time to. He was the last Cato Street conspirator to die.
So the story of the Cato Street conspiracy does not finish in 1820, it finishes in 1868, really.
And then I also wanted to ask you about, so 4 out of the 5 men transported left behind families in England.
That's correct, yeah.
Did the transported men have a way of keeping in contact with their families, and were they ever reunited?
Well, we're not absolutely sure, but we think that they were that there was some sort of contact. They did occasionally get letters, but we are not too sure whether there were any letters sent. However, I would say probably yes. We have information about where some of the wives lived, so that must have been that information must have been transferred to Australia, probably by letter. 3 of the conspirators tried to get their wives over and the families over, and 2 of them were successful. One of them I'm not too sure about whether he was successful or not. However, by the time that the wives had received the offer of a free passage, they had moved on. So they had moved on. We're talking about 6 years after this. So I'm not too sure exactly what they were, but they didn't take up the offer.
Okay. And then, how common was it for transported convicts coming to Australia? How common was it for them to have 2 families?
It was much more common than you think. What happened in Australia was like another planet away, and most people were poor and they could not afford the passage. You could get a free passage over if you applied. You might be able to get a free passage. And so what happened was a lot of people, after 6 or 7 years, they sort of gave up on their families and they then had second families. It was quite common in Australia, and 2 of the conspirators ended up with wives both in England and in Australia.
My last question is, does the Cato Street conspiracy have any significance for us today?
Yes, I would say it's quite important. It's a place. It has a place in history. It's the end of the rebellion. It's probably one of the end points of the rebellious nature of the population after Napoleonic Wars. It marks a lull in radical movements and thinking until the Luddites came in the late 1820s and early 1830s. So it was a turning point there, and affected a lull in activities of the masses against the government. Yeah, sorry. One thing about the conspirators is the knowledge of the transporter conspirators, I think, is very important. The reason why is because you can get an insight on what the conspirators were about. The conspirators, the nature of the conspirators, and why they did what they did. You can see they were given new opportunities in a place where they weren't, even though it was a convict settlement, so a place of convicts. They were given freedom, they were given opportunities, and they were given they were basically their trades were in demand. So they were given the opportunity, and we can see how the conspirators would react in a place where they were enabled to not be as repressed as they were when they were in England.
And how did they? What was that reaction then?
The reaction of the conspirators was that they seemed to be quite moral and very upright citizens in general. In general, they were, John Shaw Strange especially, he became a police officer. John Harrison also became a police officer for a short time. They were successful in their businesses. At one stage, we had John Harrison, who was the chief baker of Bathurst,
We had James Wilson, who was the chief tailor in Bathurst, and we had John Shaw Strange, who ran the Bathurst tannery. They were very successful in Australia. When they were given opportunities that they weren't given here, they were quite successful. Richard Bradburn also, two of them, Richard Bradburn and John Shaw Strange, showed that they had immense leadership skills. They really were very good leaders. Richard Bradburn was the chief carpenter at Port Macquarie Penal Settlement for 5 years, and he ended up being having quite influential friends in Australian society at the time, or New South Wales society.